Dear friend, today we will see the blood supply of the brain. Blood supply of brain. Okay. Whole of the brain is supplied by the two arterial system. Okay. One is the internal carotid artery. Internal carotid artery. And another is the vertebro-basilar artery. Vertebro-basilar artery. Okay, so there are the two arterial systems which supply the whole brain by its different branches. Okay, now what are these arteries? First come the internal carotid artery. Okay, as you know, the internal carotid artery is one of the terminal branch of the common carotid artery, which arises at the C4 vertebral level. So if you draw the diagram, look here. This is the common carotid artery, and here is the external carotid artery, and this is the internal carotid artery. And this internal carotid artery ascends upward, okay, here, and enters into the cranial cavity through the carotid canal here. And this whole internal carotid artery has the four part. Okay, here the four part. This one is the cervical, another is the petrous part, third is the cavernous part, and fourth is the cerebral part. Okay, here. So cerebral part. The cervical part ascends upward from its origin, reaches up to the lower opening of the carotid canal, and then it enters into the carotid canal. So this is the cervical part, and this internal carotid artery, the name implies here, it supplies the interior of the cranial cavity, the structure which is present in the cranial cavity. Okay, so cervical part and petrous part. Petrous part here passes through the petrous temporal bone here in the carotid canal and reaches up to the superior opening of the foramen lacerum here. Okay, then it enters into the cavernous sinus in its floor. Okay, here it passes through the floor of the cavernous sinus here, reaches up to the anterior end of the cavernous sinus here. Okay, suppose this is the petrous part. Okay, here it slightly turn here, and then it enters into the cavernous part here, runs along with the abducens nerve to its posterior lateral surface here, and this cavernous part is separated from the cavernous sinus by the endothelium. Okay, here, and then it reaches up to the anterior side of the anterior end of the cavernous sinus, and then this artery ascends upward here. Okay, here ascends upward by the side of the optic chiasma and the anterior clinoid process, and then it pierces the dura mater. Okay, it dura mater, and it reaches towards the enters into the subarachnoid space and then moves slightly posteriorly. Okay, like this. Clear? So this is the cerebral part whole. This is the cavernous part. This is the petrous part. This is the cervical part. Okay, so these are the four part here. Now, if you see, when this artery passes through the cavernous part, it runs in the floor of the cavernous sinus, so it makes a slight groove. Okay, then it ascends upward by the side of the anterior clinoid process, then pierces the dura mater, then turns slightly posteriorly. Okay, so it makes a U-shaped turn here. Okay, so it is, if we see the whole artery in the angiogram, so it makes a S-shaped curve here, like this. Okay, like this, and this is known as the carotid siphon. Carotid siphon here. Okay, so this carotid siphon is beneficial for the damping down the pulsation and the blood pressure when it reaches towards the cerebral hemisphere or cerebellum. So this is the carotid siphon here. Clear? Now, sometime what's happen, trauma to the internal carotid artery occurs in the cavernous sinus here due to fracture of the base of the skull, okay, and in accident. So this bleeding occurs in the cavernous sinus. So this happen, the arteriovenous fistula develop in the cavernous sinus here, and this give rise to the pulsating exophthalmos. Pulsating exophthalmos means the eye protrudes anteriorly and it comes outside and goes inside according to the pulsation of this artery. Okay, so this is a pulsating exophthalmos here. Okay, so this is the internal carotid artery. Now, what are the branches of the internal carotid artery? If you see, there is no branch come from the cervical part. Okay, here. Okay, the branches come from the petrous part as well as the cavernous part, okay, and the cerebral part. So today we will focus here the cerebral part, branches of the cerebral part, because we discussed the branches to the cerebral hemisphere. Now, branches from the cerebral part are here. Look here, suppose this is the artery. Okay, so first branch is come here, the ophthalmic artery. Okay, this is ophthalmic artery. It enters into the orbit and supply the structure of the orbit. Okay, then it gives rise to the here the anterior choroidal artery. Okay, anterior choroidal artery passes posteriorly here and supply the internal capsule, okay, visual pathway as well as the midbrain. Okay, yeah. So this is the anterior choroidal artery. We will see later on during the circle of Willis. Clear? And it enters into the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle to form the choroid plexus here. Clear? So it supplies the four areas. Here the visual area, the visual pathway, then the internal capsule, and the midbrain, and this inferior horn of the lateral ventricle to form the choroid plexus. Clear? So this is the anterior choroidal artery. Then it also gives rise to the here posterior communicating artery here, like this. Posterior communicating artery communicate with the posterior cerebral artery here. Okay, here in this region, the this vertebro-basilar artery or the basilar artery gives rise to the posterior cerebral artery, and this posterior cerebral artery is communicated with the internal carotid artery for the posterior communicating artery. Okay, then it divides into the two terminal branches here. This anterior cerebral artery and the middle cerebral artery, like this. Okay, so this is the anterior cerebral, this is the middle cerebral. Okay, anterior cerebral artery supply the this surface, the medial surface, and strip on the supralateral surface. Middle cerebral artery supply the lateral surface, most of the lateral surface except the superior strip and the inferior strip. Clear? So these are the branches of the this is internal carotid artery. Clear? Now, vertebro-basilar arteries. What about the vertebro-basilar artery? Vertebro-basilar arteries here. Vertebro-basilar artery formed by the vertebral artery and the basilar artery. What's happened? The vertebral artery, which arises from the first part of the subclavian artery, ascends upward, okay, through the foramen transversarium of the upper 6 cervical vertebra, okay, then it winds around the here the lateral mass of the atlas and then enter into the foramen magnum, okay, here, and same thing opposite side, like this. So vertebral artery has the four part here. One is the here the cervical part, or also known as the scaleniovertebral part, which is in the scaleniovertebral triangle here. Okay. Then the vertebral part, cervical foramen transversalium, or the upper 6 cervical vertebra. Then the third part is the suboccipital part, which passes through suboccipital triangle, and the fourth part is the here again the cranial part of the cerebral part, which enters into the cranial cavity. Clear? Now these both vertebral artery ascends upward here, and at the junction of the pons and the medulla, both artery unite, okay, to form the basilar artery, and this basilar artery runs in the sulcus, midline sulcus on the pons, that is the basilar sulcus here. Okay, so this is the vertebrobasilar artery. Clear? Now this vertebrobasilar artery gives rise to the branches. Okay, what are the branches? Okay, especially we will see the cerebral branches, cerebral part of the vertebral artery, and the basilar basilar artery. Clear? This. Here. These are the two vertebral arteries. Okay, these two vertebral arteries unite to form the basilar artery. Okay, this is the basilar artery, this is the vertebral artery. Okay, now what are the branches? Look here. The vertebral artery, the cerebral part. First branch gives rise to the anterior spinal artery, both unite in the midline to the midline spinal artery here form. Then on the posterior side, there is a posterior spinal artery come. Okay, here. Posterior spinal artery passes around the dorsal root of the specific spinal nerve and passes and divided into the medial and lateral branches and supply the this spinal cord. So this is a posterior spinal artery on the both sides. They do not unite. Okay. Then further upward here it gives the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Okay, here posterior inferior cerebellar artery here, and here anterior spinal artery supply the paramedial part of the medulla and the lower down the spinal cord, while the posterior lateral branches here, posterior lateral artery supply the spinal cord. Okay, here. Then here the anterior posterior inferior cerebellar artery, posterior inferior cerebellar artery here. This posterior inferior cerebellar artery passes around the inferior surface of the cerebellum as well as the lateral surface of the medulla and supplies the posterior lateral surface of the medulla and the inferior surface of the cerebellum. Clear? Then medullary branches. Okay, here the medullary branches directly come here and supply the lateral, anterior lateral part of the medulla. Okay, these are the medullary branches. And the last are the meningeal branches. Meningeal branches come and supply the meninges of the posterior cranial fossa here. So these are the meningeal branches. These are the medullary branches. Okay, here. So these are the branches from the vertebral artery. Okay. Now what about the basilar artery here? The basilar artery here, it gives rise to the anterior inferior cerebellar artery first, which passes anterior side of the cerebellum, okay, and supply the cerebellum, anterior surface and the inferior surface of the cerebellum. Clear? Then it gives rise to the labyrinthine artery. Okay, labyrinthine artery which enters into the internal acoustic meatus and supply the internal ear. Then it gives rise to the direct branches to the pons and the midbrain, pontine branches. Pontine branches. Okay, here. Then it gives rise to superior cerebellar artery, which passes through the superior surface of the cerebellum. Okay, superior cerebellar artery. Okay, here. So it passes on the superior surface of the cerebellum and supply the cerebellum and the midbrain. Okay, here. It passes along the cerebellum. And last is here, it gives rise to the it divided into the two terminal branches there is a posterior cerebral artery. Okay, here. This is the posterior cerebral artery. This posterior cerebral artery supplies the occipital lobe, okay, of the tentorium surface of the cerebellum and the lower strip of the superolateral surface of the cerebellum towards the occipital lobe. And also it gives rise to the posterior corodial branches from the choroidal plexus of the third ventricle and the central part of the lateral ventricle. Okay, so these are this posterior cerebral artery. So posterior cerebral artery, in short, it supplies the occipital lobe of the cerebellum and the tentorial surface of cerebellum. Okay, then it supplies the strip on the, suppose this is the, okay, same, a lower strip of the superolateral surface of the cerebellum here. Lower strip of the superolateral surface of this area. Okay, here. Supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. Also give rise to the posterior choroidal artery for the third ventricle and the lateral ventricle, especially the central part. Clear? So these are the branches of the basilar artery, vertebro-basilar artery. Come on the important arterial anastomotic circle, that is the circle of Willis. Circle of Willis, or that is the circulus arteriosus. Circulus arteriosus. Okay. What is circulus arteriosus? Look here. There is an anastomosis occur between the branches of the internal carotid artery and internal carotid artery itself and the posterior cerebral artery. So one circle is formed here in the interpeduncular fossa here, and this is the circle of Willis here. So look here. Suppose these are the optic nerve. This is the optic chiasma. Okay, here. And here is the internal carotid artery on the two sides, lateral to the optic chiasma and the optic trachea, and this internal carotid artery gives rise to the anterior cerebral artery, okay, on the both sides. Here. Okay, these are. And anterior cerebral artery united in the midline here by the anterior communicating artery. Clear? Now, here is the basilar artery. Okay, basilar artery gives rise to the posterior cerebral artery, which we have discussed now. Okay, here. Now, this posterior cerebral artery and internal carotid artery are communicated by the posterior communicating branch. Okay, here. It is communicated by the posterior communicating. So, what's happened? One multi-angle circle, not the rectangular, multi-angle circle is formed here, and this is now the circle of Willis. And the circle of Willis is formed by the, if you look here, anterior, it is formed by the anterior communicating artery. Anterior communicating artery. Anterolaterally, it is formed by the anterior cerebral artery. Okay. Laterally, it is formed by the internal carotid artery. Posterolaterally here, it is formed by the posterior communicating artery. And posterior part is formed by the posterior cerebral artery. Okay, so this is a one circle is formed. Okay, now what are the branches? Okay, branches of this circle. 4 branches. What the functional importance? Functional importance of this circle is this circle, arterial circle, maintains the pressure in all the arteries on the both side of the cerebral hemisphere here. So it makes a equal distribution here. Okay, the pressure first. Second is if any artery is blocked. Okay, suppose there is a thrombosis occur here. Okay, so blood passes through this circular anastomosis to the other side of the artery to that side of the brain. Okay, so this is make a alternative channel for the supplying to the brain here. Clear? So this is the two benefit occur. One is the equalizes the pressure. Okay, by this is anastomosing, and the supply the blood to the opposite side if any artery is blocked. Okay, so these are the two function. Okay, now what are the branches? Branches of this circle of Willis are the two type of the branches are there. One are the central branches and the cortical branch. Okay, central branches are they supply the superficial structure. Okay, here central, and the cortical branches they enter into the cortex, cerebral cortex, and supply the deeper structure here. So the two type of the branches comes out. Okay, now come on the one by one. The first are the central branches. Okay, the central branches are here. They come from the all around here. Okay, these are the one is the anteromedial branches, we can say that. So anteromedial branches come from the anterior communicating and the anterior cerebral. Okay, so these are the anteromedial branches. Yeah, so these anteromedial branches come from the anterior communicating artery or anterior cerebral artery. Okay, here. And they supply the anterior perforated substance and the structure which is present here. Okay, one of the anteromedial branch is long. Okay, here we supply the anterior perforated substance and also the anterior limb and the genu of the internal capsule. Okay, and this artery is known as the long artery. This is a recurrent artery of the hubera. Recurrent artery of the hubera. Okay, this one of the anteromedial branch long come from the anterior cerebral, that is a recurrent artery of the hubera. Okay. And as this artery is long, and this artery is supply the chordate nucleus. Okay, chordate nucleus, anterior limb, and the genu of the internal capsule. As this artery is long, completely long, so this artery is most prone to develop thrombosis in this artery. So when this artery thrombosis develop, so what's happen? There is the fasciobranchial monoplagia. Okay, it gives rise to the fasciobranchial monoplagia. Means in the fasciobranchial monoplagia, what's happen? The half of the face and the one limb, upper limb, is paralyzed to the opposite side. Okay, so this is another fasciobranchial monoplagia. It is due to the recurrent artery of the humeral thrombosis. Okay, so these are the anteromedial branches. Then the anterolateral branches. Okay, anterolateral branches, they come from this is the middle cerebral artery. Okay, here. Now, middle cerebral artery here give rise to anterolateral branches. Okay, anterolateral branches, and this anterolateral branches here, and this is the anterior perforated substance here. Okay, and this anterolateral branch, these are the anterolateral branches or the striate branches, also known as the lenticulostriate artery. Lenticulostriate striate artery. Okay. So these come from the middle cerebral artery. Okay, this is the middle cerebral artery. Okay. So these lenticular striate artery or the anterolateral and this is lateral striate arteries. Okay, they come and enter into the this anterior perforated substance. So these anterolateral branches supply the internal capsule and the lentiform nucleus here in this area. Okay, so here along with this anteromedial also supply the internal capsule, but here the lenticular striate arteries especially supply the lentiform nucleus and the whole majority of the internal capsule, especially the genu and the posterior limb. Okay, here. So one of the artery here in this anterolateral branch here is more prone to hemorrhage. Okay, is more prone to hemorrhage due to high blood pressure. Okay, and that artery is known as the Charcot artery. This is a Charcot's artery of the cerebral hemorrhage. So when this artery's hemorrhage occur, there is a contralateral hemiplasia of the body occur along with the facial muscle, along with the loss of the sensation of the opposite half of the body. Okay, so this because it supply the genu and the posterior limb. Okay, so the genu and the posterior limb, the fiber descends downward for the opposite half of the body, and also there is a facial muscles are paralyzed. Clear? So this is give rise to the hemiplagia. Okay, contralateral hemiplagia. Okay. So these are the anterolateral branches. Then the posteromedial group. Posteromedial group here come from the posterior communicating artery and the posterior cerebral artery here. These are the posteromedial group. Okay. So posteromedial group of the central artery arises from the posterior communicating artery and the proximal part of the posterior cerebral artery. And these artery are also known as the thalamoperforator. Thalamoperforator because these arteries supply the thalamus, anterior part of the thalamus, hypophysis, okay, hypothalamus, anterior medial group of the nuclei of the thalamus, subthalamus, and the tegmentum of the midbrain. Okay, here. So these regions are supplied by this posterior medial branches or the thalamoperforator artery. Clear? Central branches here of the posterolateral group comes from the posterior cerebral artery here. This here on the distal part of the posterior cerebral artery. These are the posterolateral central branches. They are also known as the thalamo-geniculate arteries. Thalamo-geniculate artery. And these thalamo-geniculate arteries supply the posterior part of the thalamus, especially the pulvinar, lateral and the medial geniculate body, and the lateral and the ventral and large ventral group of the thalamic nuclei here. Okay, so these are known as the thalamo-geniculate artery. Clear? So these are the branches which comes from the circulovulus. If you revise, first the anteromedial branches come from the anterior communicating branch and the anterior cerebral artery. One of the branches long, the recurrent artery of the humor, most commonly thrombose here. Then the anterolateral branches, these are the striate branches, they enter into the anterior perforated substance. These are also known as the lenticulostriate branches because they supply the lenticular nucleus and the genu or internal capsule, genu of the genuine posterior limb of the internal capsule here. Okay, so lenticular striate artery, and this lenticular artery, one of the lenticular artery is most probably prone to develop hemorrhage. This is the Charcot artery. Okay, here. So this is the anterolateral branches. Then the posterior medial branches. Posterior medial branches come from the posterior communicating artery and the posterior cerebral artery, and they are the also known as the thalamoperforator artery because they supply the anterior part of the thalamus, especially the anterior and medial group of the nucleus, and the hypophysis and the hypothalamus. Clear? While the posterolateral cortical branches come from the posterior cerebral artery, they also know thalamogeneculated artery. They supply the distal half of the thalamus along with the pulvinar, geniculate body and the midbrain. So these are the branches of the circle of Willis. It's very, very important. Okay. Now after this come on the cortical branches. Okay. These cortical branches comes from the whole of the circle of Willis and supply the cortex. Suppose, look here, this is the cerebral cortex, a cerebral hemisphere. Okay, here, and suppose this is the circle of Willis. Okay, so these cortical branches comes here and runs perpendicular to the surface of the cerebral hemisphere, and it enters into the substance of the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, and they supply the cortical part, peripheral gray matter, and further deep enters to deep and supply the part of the white matter here. So these are known as the cortical branches. These cortical branches have the short cortical branches and the long cortical branches. Short cortical branches supply the gray matter, okay, peripheral part gray matter, and the long cortical branches enters into the deep into the white matter and supply the white matter. Peripheral branches here, which supply the short here, they are the not end artery, they are anastomos. While the long artery which enters into the white matter, they are the end arteries because they do not anastomose to each other. Okay, so these are the cortical branches here. Clear? Now come on the anterior cerebral artery, the three major artery which supply the different surfaces of the cerebral hemisphere here. So now we'll draw the diagram. Look here, this is the lateral surface. Okay, here, and here is the medial surface. Okay, here. Now look here, and this is the central sulcus here. This is the this lateral sulcus, the central sulcus here. Okay, here, and on the lower side, these are the different sulci on the temporal surface. Okay, inferior surface of temporal lobe. Okay, now anterior cerebral artery. Anterior cerebral artery, it arises from the this intraneculated artery. Intraneculated artery reaches towards the lateral to the this optic chiasma, and from the optic chiasma here, this artery give rise to the two terminal branches, the anterior cerebral and the middle cerebral. Anterior cerebral artery passes towards the anterior or the midline fissure, okay, medial longitudinal fissure, and reaches towards the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, and then it gives rise to the branches. Okay, now what are the branches of this artery here? Okay, first this artery gives rise to the one branch on the orbital surface of frontal lobe. This is known as the orbital branch. Orbital branch, which supply the half of the orbital surface of the frontal lobe. Okay, here. Then the another frontopolar branch here, which supply passes for the frontal pole. Okay, here. Okay, this is the artery. Okay, so this is the frontopolar branch. Frontopolar branch, which supply the medial surface of the frontal lobe. Okay, here. Then caloso-marginal branch here. This caloso-marginal branch supplies the medial frontal, okay, here is the medial frontal gyrus, and the paracentral lobule. Here will be the paracentral lobule here. Okay, here the paracentral lobule and the precuneus. This area is known as the precuneus. Okay, here. So this calojomarginal branch. This is the calojomarginal branch. Clear? Yeah. So calojomarginal branch supply the this middle frontal lobe and this precuneus part and the paracentral lobule. Clear? Then remaining artery passes, anterior cerebral artery passes posteriorly here. Okay, and this is the pericallosal branch. This is the which passes through the callosal sulcus. Pericallosal branch of the artery here. Clear? And this pericallosal branch here supply the corpus callosum and the cingulate gyrus here, and the remaining part of the medial surface of the cerebrum above the this corpus callosum here, not up to the posterior side here or the occipital lobe. It is restricted to the parietal lobe. Clear? So this is the pericallosal branch. Okay, here. So now what's happen if this artery is thrombosis of the anterior cerebral artery occurs here? So thrombosis of the anterior cerebral artery when occur, it gives rise to the weakness or the loss of the muscles of the foot and the leg, because here the paracentral lobule represent the muscles, and also the sensation of the foot and the leg are lost here in the thrombosis of the anterior cerebral artery. And also the sense of stereognosis. Yes, sense of the stereognosis is also lost because it supply the precuneus part. So this is the anterior cerebral artery. Now come on the middle cerebral artery. Middle cerebral artery here, after arising from the intraneculated artery, it passes through the lateral sulcus and comes on the lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere here. Okay, suppose this is the here intraneculated artery, it comes here on the lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere, the supralateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, now this artery now give rise to the branches. Okay, suppose this is the artery here, this is the artery. Now this gives rise to the different branches to the different lobe. Okay, this gives rise to the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, and the temporal lobe. Okay, here. So what are the branches? So branches to the frontal lobe. One is the orbitofrontal branch. Okay, orbitofrontal branch supply the here the orbital surface of the frontal lobe, half of the frontal lobe, or the lateral half of the orbital surface of the frontal lobe. Okay, here. So the orbitofrontal branch. Then the another branch here is a pre-Lowlandic branch or precentric branch. Okay, here. Precentral. This is a central sulcus. This is a precentral branch. So this is the precentral branch. This is the orbitofrontal branch. Okay, here. So this precentral branch or the pre-Lowlandic branch supply the frontal cortex, especially the Broca's area. Okay, here. And this is the postcentral branch here, or the post-Lowlandic branch, which runs posterior to the central sulcus here. Okay, here. And this branch supply this motor area, principal motor area, and the principal sensory area here. Okay, which is present along the central sulcus here. So they supply the primary motor cortex and the primary sensory cortex here. Clear? So these are the frontal branches. Clear? Now come on the parietal branches. Parietal branches are here. These are the anterior parietal branch. Okay, this is the anterior parietal branch and the posterior parietal branch. Okay, here posterior parietal branch. Anterior parietal branch supply the anterior part of the parietal lobe, and the posterior parietal branch supply the posterior part of the parietal lobe, and this posterior parietal branch anastomose with the one of the artery from the posterior cerebral artery here in the occipital region here. this anastomosis supply the macular area of the occipital lobe here. Okay, so both artery, posterior cerebral artery and the posterior parietal artery. Posterior cerebral artery is different, and the posterior parietal artery come from the middle cerebral artery. They anastomose and supply the macular area is preserved. If any one artery is blocked or the thrombosis occurs, the blood passes to the other artery. Okay? So this is the posterior parietal artery, which anastomoses with the posterior cerebral artery, the macular branch of the posterior cerebral artery. Now, these are the parietal branches. Come on the temporal branches. What about the temporal branches? Temporal branches are the anterior temporal branch. These are the anterior temporal branch. Okay, which supply the lateral surface of the temporal lobe. Okay, here and the pole. So this is the anterior temporal branches. Okay, then the posterior temporal branches here. Posterior temporal branches passes lateral surface of the temporal lobe, and they supply the especially the vernix area. Okay, here. This supply the vernix area here of the speech, especially in the left cerebral hemisphere. Okay, in the right-handed person. So these are the posterior temporal branches. Clear? Now, what's happened in the middle cerebral artery is thrombosis occur. So thrombosis of the middle cerebral artery give rise to the this hemiplasia of the body of the opposite side, because the most of the body is represented on the lateral side here. Okay, here cerebral hemisphere on the soprolateral part here. It is not, I told you, not supplied by the middle cerebral artery. It is supplied by the anterior cerebral artery on the strip along the soprolateral surface here. Clear? So this area is paralyzed here in the thrombosis of the middle cerebral artery, give rise to the contralateral hemiplasia and the contralateral loss of the sensory sensation, and also the aphasia occur because the blockage areas are disturbed here due to this blockage of the pre-Rolandic branch. Clear? So this is the middle cerebral artery. What about the posterior cerebral artery? Posterior cerebral artery here, if you draw the diagram on the inferior surface of the temporal lobe. So this is the frontal lobe here, and this is the temporal lobe, and this is the midbrain area. Okay, here. So this is the temporal. Now, what about the posterior cerebral artery? Posterior cerebral artery, as you know, it is one of the branch of the terminal branch of the basilar artery. Here, this is the posterior cerebral artery, and this posterior cerebral artery here winds around the cerebral peduncle. Okay, and supply the cerebral peduncle, and we have seen the midbrain area. Clear? Now, this posterior cerebral artery gives rise to different branches which supply the inferior surface of the temporal lobe as well as the up to the occipital lobe on the medial side. Okay, here, and also the lateral side here. So what are the branches? Look here. First is the temporo-occipital branch here. These are the temporo-occipital branches here. Temporo-occipital branches supply the inferior surface of the temporal lobe and the lateral surface of the occipital lobe. We have seen here. Okay, these are the lateral surface of the occipital lobe and the inferior surface of temporal lobe. Then it also gives rise to the internal occipital branch. Is very important here. Internal occipital branch runs into the inferior and medial surface of the temporal lobe, and here it divides into the two branches. One is the parieto-occipital branch and the calcanean branch here. This is the parieto-occipital branch, and one is the calcanean branch here. Okay, here. we supply the calcaline sulcus in the occipital lobe, and the parieto-occipital branch supply the the lateral surface of the occipital lobe along with the parietal lobe, small part of the parietal lobe. So these are the parieto-occipital branches. What's happen if this posterior cerebral artery is thrombosed? Okay, thrombosis of the posterior cerebral artery give rise to the homonymous hemianopia here, because the most of the occipital lobe is supplied by this posterior cerebral artery. So the visual area are disturbed or the paralysis occur here. So this is the homonymous hemianopia, means half of the field of the both eyes are lost here. So this is the homonymous hemianopia. But the macular fibers are spared. Okay, I told you macular fibers, so because there is an anastomosis occur between the posterior cerebral artery and the middle cerebral artery. So when the posterior cerebral artery is thrombosed, the blood comes from the middle cerebral artery, which supply the macular area of the vision or the occipital cortex here. So these are the different three arteries. Major artery, the anterior cerebral artery here. Okay, this anterior cerebral artery, the middle cerebral artery, and the posterior cerebral artery. Venous drainage. Okay, venous drainage of this brain. The whole of the blood drain into the different venous sinuses, dural venous sinuses, face different surfaces related to the different sinuses. Okay, so whatever the sinuses present in that particular surface, near to the surface, the vein of these surfaces directly drain into the nearby sinuses. Okay, so now the two peculiarity of these veins of the brains are here. First, they are the valvulus. Okay, and they are very thin because they do not have the muscular muscles in the wall of the vein here. So they are thin vein, okay, and they are the valvulus. Two peculiarities of these veins of the cerebral hemisphere of the brains are seen. Now, what are the different veins? Okay, so whole of the cerebral hemisphere, lateral surface and the medial surface especially, they are drained by the two sets of the veins, superficial and the deep. Superficial veins and the deep vein. Okay, what are the superficial veins? Look here. Now, suppose this is the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, here, and this is the midbrain. Okay, this is the cerebellum. Here is the pons, medulla, and the spinal cord. Okay, now here this is the lateral sulcus. First come the superficial veins here. Superficial veins are three in number. Okay, first is the superficial cerebral vein. Superficial cerebral vein drains the blood from the superolateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere, and they runs obliquely. Okay, here, and they drain into the superior sagittal sinus directly here. So these are the superficial cerebral vein here, and this is the superior sagittal sinus. Okay, here. Okay, so this is superior sagittal sinus, where the superficial cerebral vein directly enters into the superior sagittal sinus here. Okay, now one is the superficial middle cerebral vein. Okay, superficial middle cerebral vein come from the here the lateral sulcus. It is located in the lateral sulcus here. It drains into the from the medial surface of the cerebellum, and this vein is communicated with the superior sagittal sinus. Okay, superior sagittal through the superior anastomotic vein here. Okay, this is the superior anastomotic vein. Okay, so this superficial middle cerebral vein, one end it is connected to the superior sagittal sinus, so the superficial anastomotic vein of the Tollard. This is the superficial anastomotic vein of Tollard. Okay, here. Inferiorly it is communicated with the inferior anastomotic vein of the labii with the transverse sinus here. Okay, here, this is the transverse sinus here. Okay, transverse sinus. Okay, so the inferior anastomotic vein of the labii. This is the inferior anastomotic vein of labii. So this vein, this superficial middle cerebral vein communicated with the transverse sinus here. Okay, so this is the superficial middle cerebral vein, and this superficial middle cerebral vein anteriorly here. Okay, anteriorly it drains into the cavernous sinus. Okay, cavernous sinus. So we can say now the superficial middle cerebral vein drains into the three separate sinuses. Anteriorly drains into the cavernous sinus, superiorly through the anastomotic vein enter into the superior sagittal sinus, inferiorly through the inferior anastomotic vein enters into the transverse sinus. Okay, so this is then the inferior cerebral vein. Okay, inferior cerebral vein here, which come from the inferior surface of the cerebellum or the temporal surface here, it enters into the transverse sinus directly here. Okay, this end into the transverse sinus. Also it end into the straight sinus here in the midline. There is a straight sinus there, so it also drains into the straight sinus. It anteriorly it also communicated with the cavernous sinus. Okay, while in the middle it is communicated with the superior petrosus sinus. Okay, in this area. So this is the superior petrosus sinus, anteriorly the cavernous sinus. Okay, here, and posteriorly to the transverse sinus and the straight sinus. Okay, here. So these are the superficial veins which is situated on the superficial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Okay. What about the base, on the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere? So superficial vein on the base of the cerebral hemisphere are the basal veins. Okay, here if you see on the base, there the basal veins are there, and these basal veins are formed by the communication of the two veins. Okay, these are the deep middle cerebral vein which come on the medial side. Okay, middle. Okay, deep middle cerebral vein and the anterior cerebral vein. Okay, yeah. So on the surface, on the base of the surface, basal part here, the anterior cerebral vein. Okay, here, and the deep middle cerebral vein unite to form the basal vein. Okay, and this basal vein unite with the great cerebral vein of the Gillen. We will see later on. Okay, yeah. So on the on the inferior surface of the basal surface, the whole of the surface is drained by this basal vein, which is formed by the anterior cerebral vein and the this deep cerebral vein. Come on the deep veins. What about the deep veins? Okay, which come from the deeper aspect of the this cerebral hemisphere around the thalamus here. Look here now. Suppose this separate this is the corpus callosum. Okay, this is the septum pellucidum. Okay, this area, and here are the thalamus. Okay, thalamus are here, and this is the choroid plexus of the third ventricle. Okay, now what about the deep veins? Okay, deep veins are comprises of the septal veins, okay, which passes along the septum. Okay, these are the septum pellucidum. Okay, these are the septal veins which unite in the midline. Okay, this septal vein. Okay, here passes on the lateral side here, and these septal veins unite with the thalamostriate vein. This is the thalamostriate vein. Okay, here, and these are the choroidal vein, which comes from the choroid plexus. So these three veins, okay, here the septal vein, thalamostriate vein, and the choroidal vein unite here to form the internal cerebral vein. Okay, here. So this is opposite side of the thalamostriate vein. This is the choroidal vein, unite to form the internal cerebral vein. Okay, and this internal cerebral vein of the both side, okay, unite to form the great cerebral vein of Galen. Okay, here they come. Great cerebral vein of the Galen comes out deep to the splenium, or the below the splenium here of the corpus callosum, and this great cerebral vein of the Galen unite with the inferior sagittal sinus to form the straight sinus. Okay, straight sinus. Okay. So this is the inferior sagittal sinus. Okay. So in this fashion, the great cerebral vein passes in and into the straight sinus. So these are the deep vein. Okay, here. Now, veins from the cerebellum. If you see the veins of the cerebellum and the brainstem, how these vein drains here. Now, from the cerebellum, suppose this is the cerebellum. Okay, here. And this is the midbrain. Here, this is the pons and the medulla. Okay. Now, what's happened here in the when it drains from the cerebellum and the brainstem, from the upper surface of the cerebellum here. Okay, here. From the upper surface of the cerebellum, veins end into the straight sinus, because here the cerebellum is situated below the tentorium cerebelli, and in the midline of the tentorium cerebelli there is a straight sinus here. So suppose this is the straight sinus. Okay, here. This. So the vein from this vein from the upper surface of the cerebellum directly into the straight sinus. Okay, and the transverse sinus and the superior petrosus sinus here, because the straight sinus continue with the transverse sinus, the left transverse sinus. Okay, so the vein drains into here, and the this transverse sinus communicated with the superior sinus communicated with the cavernous sinus here, so it also enter into the superior sagittal sinus here. Okay, so the vein from the superior surface of the cerebellum drains into the three sinus: the straight sinus, transverse sinus, okay, and the superior petrosal sinus. Okay, here. From the inferior surface, okay, from the inferior surface, look here, from the inferior surface here, that from the inferior surface of the cerebellum drains into the right and left sigmoid sinus. This transverse sinus when reaches anteriorly, okay, and turn and continue with the sigmoid sinus here. Okay, so these mostly they drain into the sigmoid sinus, also the part of the transverse sinus, because the sigmoid sinus vein continue with the internal jugular vein here. It is communicated with the cavernous sinus to the inferior petrosal sinus. So not a sagittal petrosal sinus. So inferior petrosal sinus, this in lower surface of the cerebellum, drains into the inferior petrosal sinus. Okay. Now veins of the midbrain. What about the midbrain? Here, this area. The vein from the midbrain drains into the great cerebral vein of the Galen here, because the midbrain is situated on the clivus. Okay, here. So at the clivus here, below the splenium part of the corpus callosum. So below the splenium part, the great cerebral vein Galen comes out. So this on the superior surface of the brain, midbrain here, drain into the great cerebral vein of Galen. Okay, yeah. So this is a midbrain. What about the pons and the medulla here? So this pons and medulla drains into the superior and inferior petrosal sinus, because they are also related to the petrosal sinus, superior petrosal and inferior petrosal. They drain into here and also into the occipital sinus here. Sorry, here it drains into the occipital sinus on the posterior side here. So pons and medulla veins drains into the occipital sinus, okay, and inferior petrosal sinus and also the transverse sinus. Okay? So these are the veins draining from the different part of the cerebral hemisphere as well as the brain stem and the cerebellum. Now, important this term is used as a blood-brain barrier. Blood-brain barrier. What is blood-brain barrier? Blood-brain barrier is at most of the sites in the brain, there is a between the arteries and the tissue of the brain, there is a barrier is developed, which only permits the few particles of the selected drugs which enters through this barrier. Okay. Otherwise, this barrier is resistance to cross the antibodies and antigen. So this is not the blood-brain barrier. Now, what about the blood-brain barrier? The structure from the blood-brain barrier, the three structure. Look here. Suppose this is the capillary endothelium. Okay, here. This is the basement membrane of the capillary endothelium. Okay, and outside here, the foot process of the astrocytes. Okay, so these are foot process. So the three structure from the blood-brain barrier. These are the capillary endothelium first, the basement membrane of the capillary endothelium, and the tightly adhere foot process of the astrocytes here. So these three structure from the blood-brain, and this foot processes of the astrocytes cover almost the 80% of the surface of the capillaries here. Okay, which form the tight junction between each other and the capillary. So this is the blood-brain barrier. Okay. Now at certain sites in the brain, there no blood barrier is present here. What are these sites? These sites are the one is the pineal gland. Okay, and then the hypophysis, especially the neurohypophysis. Then OVLET, organ vascular lenticularum. Okay, organo vascular vasculosum lamina terminalis. Okay, here in front of the lamina terminalis, there are certain areas there. These are the organovasculosum lamina terminalis. This also do not have the blood-brain barrier. Okay, here. Then the median eminence of the hypothalamus. Median eminence of hypothalamus. Okay, subcommissural organ. Subcommissural organ, and the last subfrontal organ. Subfornical organ, and the last is the area posterima. Okay, area posterima, which is vomiting centers in the floor of the fourth ventricle here. So these are the sites where the blood-brain barrier is absent. So the particle or the antigen or the antibody or the any toxins directly enter to these areas and stimulate these areas. So this is the blood-brain barrier. So I think this is all about the blood supply of the brain. Thank you.